So today, we're going to dig into a huge legal case that answers a really important question. If you give out bad professional advice, who exactly pays the price? The answer, it turns out, comes from something called the Caparo test. Let's get right into it. I mean, really think about that for a second. We put our trust in experts all the time, right? Accountants, doctors, you name it. But what happens when their advice goes south and costs you a ton of money? Can you actually sue them? Well, the answer is it's pretty complicated. And believe it or not, the rules we use today were forged in this massive corporate battle back in the 80s. And we're not talking about a small mistake here. This was a big deal. An audit report made a company look like it was in great financial health. So another company saw that report and spent millions buying them out. The problem? That company was actually a total financial disaster. This one multi-million-dollar mistake basically forced the courts to draw a whole new line in the sand for professional responsibility. And that brings us right to the heart of the story, the case of Caparo Industries versus Dickman. This wasn't just some boring courtroom drama. This was a high-stakes financial showdown that would change the rules of the game for good. Okay, so here are the players. You've got Caparo Industries, the investor, looking to buy another company. They look at the company's books, which have been audited and signed off on by an accounting firm, Dickman and Company. Everything looked great on paper, so Caparo jumped in and bought the company. But, surprise, after the deal was done, they found out the finances were a complete mess. They had paid way too much, and they pointed the finger straight at the auditors and their flawed report. Now, for Caparo to have any chance of winning, they had to prove one single, absolutely crucial thing, that the auditors, Dickman, owed them what's called a duty of care. This one legal idea became the entire battleground for this case. So what in the world is a duty of care? Well, it's just a legal responsibility to be careful so you don't cause harm to other people. You know, a doctor owes a duty of care to their patient. A driver owes one to everyone else on the road. And Caparo argued, hey, these auditors owed a duty of care to us, the potential investors, to make sure their audit was right. Seems pretty logical, doesn't it? Well, that simple argument created a massive problem for the courts. Because this was the big question. If the court sided with Caparo, where does it stop? Would an auditor be legally responsible to literally anyone anywhere on the planet who happens to read their report and makes a bad investment? I mean, that could open the floodgates to an absolute tidal wave of lawsuits. It could paralyze the entire accounting profession. So to figure this out, the UK's highest court came up with a brand new playbook. Instead of a simple yes or no, they created this really smart three-part test to decide when a duty of care should exist, especially when it's just about money. And this, my friends, became the famous Caparo test. Think of it like a three-stage filter. If you want to prove there's a duty of care, you have to pass all three parts. 1. Was the harm foreseeable? 2. Was there a relationship of proximity? And 3, would it be fair, just, and reasonable to impose that duty? Let's break each one down. All right, first up, foreseeability. This is the first hurdle, and honestly, it's probably the most straightforward one. The court basically asks, could you have reasonably guessed that what you were doing might end up hurting this person? In Caparo's case, was it foreseeable that an investor might read a bad audit report and lose a bunch of money? Yeah, the court said that's pretty foreseeable. So, check. Caparo cleared hurdle number 1. But just because something is foreseeable doesn't mean you're on the hook. Next up is the second and I'd say most important part of the test, proximity. Now this is where it gets really interesting. Proximity here has nothing to do with being physically near someone. It's all about how close the legal relationship is. Think of it this way. An accountant who gives you direct advice, one-on-one, has a very proximate relationship with you. But what about that same accountant whose report is just out there for the general public to read? That's a different story. And this is exactly where Caparo's whole case started to fall apart. And you know what? A quote from the final judgment just nails this point. The court found there was no proximate relationship. Why? Because the auditors were hired by the company to create a report for its current shareholders so they could check up on management. The report was never meant to be an investment guide for outsiders like Caparo. There was just no direct connection. So that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. This is kind of like the court's big picture safety valve. Is it fair, just, and reasonable to impose a duty of care? This is where the court zooms out and looks at public policy. They ask, okay, forget the specifics for a second. would imposing this duty be a good thing for society as a whole? And in this case, they were really worried about, again, opening those floodgates. They decided it would simply not be fair or reasonable to make auditors liable to an infinite number of investors. It would make their jobs impossibly risky and probably drive up the cost of business for everybody.
Okay, so we have the three-part test. Let's see how it all played out in the final verdict for Caparo and what kind of legacy this case left behind.
All right, the multi-million-dollar question. After all that, did the auditors have to write Caparo a giant check?
The answer was a hard no. Caparo lost. So here's the bottom line on why they lost. Yeah, the harm was foreseeable, but they failed the test. There was no proximity. The auditors didn't make that report for Caparo, and from a public policy view, the court decided it would be totally unfair to make auditors liable to basically the entire world.
And the impact of this case was huge. It was a real game changer. Before 1990, the rules were kind of fuzzy. But after this case, the Caparo test created a much clearer, more structured framework. And it's now used for all kinds of professions, not just accountants. We're talking lawyers, engineers, architects, you name it. It defines the boundaries of their legal responsibilities. And that's really the main takeaway here. The Caparo test makes sure that professionals are held accountable for their work, but it also protects them from being responsible to everyone for everything. At the end of the day, the relationship and the purpose of the advice is what really matters. But that does leave us with a pretty interesting question for today, doesn't it? This test was born in 1990, way before the internet could blast information to billions of people in a split second. In an age where one bad piece of advice can go viral in minutes, is this test still the right tool for the job? Where should we draw that line on professional responsibility now? That's a challenge our courts are still grappling with.